listeners, I'm Robin Black, and this is It's All About Healing podcast. In today's episode, we have a special guest with us, Miss Sheila. She is an author as well, but she's going to share with us her story about grief. She dealt with her son's death in a snowboarding accident, but she also tells us about how she started writing to heal as well. So, Sheila, how are you today?
I'm good. Thank you very much, and thank you for having me.
No problem. So tell us a little bit about your story.
Well, I'm going to say that I began writing seriously after my daughter was born. She was uh, a toddler, and I had this urge to write for a long, long time, but I hadn't. So I began when, some of the early things about dealing with an infant, especially a first infant, had kind of quieted down a little. But I always remember that when she came home with me from the hospital, I looked at her and I said, Emily Ruth Bender, who are you? And I heard inside my head, Sheila Bender, Mom, who are you? And
Mhm,
that was a kind of really haunting question. So as soon as I could get it together to attend classes for writing, and that was poetry, I started to do it. And it became like my best tool for expressing myself, for helping others by sharing my work, by teaching
mhm,
them. Um, and over the years, and then uh, when my son was 2 years younger than my daughter, so 23 years of his life, he did die in a snowboarding accident. And I really believe that if I hadn't had the tools of writing poetry and prose, but to a large extent poetry, I don't know that I could have healed from that grief
mhm.
as quickly. I, I mean, not that it was quick, 7 years of writing about it. But every time I wrote about it, something wonderful happened. Like
Mhm.
just articulating the conversation you need to have um, helps a lot. And in
Yeah,
our culture, poetry is a place to do that and to hear other people's conversations about that, the dark things in life, the dark emotions. And there is healing through the dark emotions. I think people get in trouble when they can't articulate it, they can't share it. They, it's just in them, but they can't release their own thinking. So
yeah,
I really do credit, and I'm not the only writer who, especially poet, who credits writing with saving their lives.
yeah.
It's magic.
Absolutely. I like that. So tell us a little bit about yourself, if you don't mind my asking, about coping with that. I know you said it took 7 years, but I'm sure that that never heals. So
No,
how do you cope with
yeah.
that?
I think what I learned is that, and I learned this like within a couple of years, that my way of continuing had to include him and
Yeah.
not just memories of him, which were really important, but it had to include living in his honor. And so he was an architect. He was the kind of person who would, in his graduate studies, come to his student friends and say, hey, the migrant farmers in the Central Valley of California, that's where he went to graduate school, are working all day in the sun, and then they wait for a bus to take them home in the sun. He said, let's go design and build them a bus shelter.
Hmm.
So they did that, and it was a big project, and, we proudly went to see it. We were excited for the kids that they had finished it, and he was always, concerned with designing spaces outside and inside for people to be comfortable and to connect in community. So I am not an architect, but
Hmm.
I am a writer, and so, I began my big effort in his honor, which was creating my website, which is called Writing It Real. And it's
Hmm.
dedicated to facilitating people in writing personal experience, whether that's poetry or prose, long prose, short prose, whatever they're writing. I know I can facilitate them in getting over inertia and in believing in themselves as writers. And so it took us a couple of years. My husband was in computing, so he wasn't in programming, but he got a friend who was a programmer in those days. This is 2002. the internet was nothing like it is today. And
Yeah.
so we needed individual programming to make a website. He helped me figure out what would work. My husband did as a website. And I began, and I reached out to people who had studied with me already and told them I would offer, and they had been readers of my books. I had a few out by then. I told them I would send them an article a week about writing by email.
Yeah.
They became members of Writing It Real. And 2 years later, I was teaching online. It was like time. It was okay to have online classes. And
Hmm.
I began doing that. And I was always also teaching in person until the pandemic. So that's a long stretch of time from 2002 or four when I launched, two when I launched the site to almost the present. And it's been thrilling to share what I've learned about writing. I just a little tiny bit more about my experience because it might help others. If you have had the desire to write, whether it's been for a long time or because of some trauma in your life, and you think writing will help, you can.
Yeah.
That's what I learned. And I want to help people do that. And I was fortunate enough to study with poets. I lived very close to the University of Washington when my kids were little. And I studied with a number of poets. We had a lot of famous visiting poets. And I could study as a non matriculating student because I had a teaching degree. So I
Yeah.
was very lucky. And it just changed everything about the way I think about writing, working with them, understanding how poets think, how they don't judge their words, how they grow their pieces, how they respond to one another in a way that encourages writing and doesn't, grade it like we are all used to from school, right? And being told what doesn't work and all that. So the eye was always towards how will we make it work? What's missing?
Mhm.
What can we do? And I made some very good friends who were extremely helpful. Of course, not everybody was kind, but I chose the kind people to be part of my tribe, and I learned from them. And then when so the first books that I wrote were, aside from a small book of my own poems, were instructional books. And one of my favorite memories is being a part-time teacher teaching freshman composition, which is the first English class most people take when they come to college, whether it's community college or four-year schools. And I had a really interesting class. They were a lot of nurses who were going back to school for a different degree, and they would have been up all night working, and then they came to class ready to go to sleep, but they came to class.
Yeah.
All kinds of really dedicated people who were, say, behind in their writing, even though I really don't think it's that way, and were more than that afraid of it, like they couldn't do it. So I invoked what the poets taught me, and I had them writing and publishing in some cases. They were working from their personal experience, and it was very thrilling. So I just never wanted to not do that again. I just kept doing it.
Absolutely. And I know, like for myself with poetry to me feels more like connecting, whether it's with loss, whether it's with, it's all about communication. I connect more with pain and adversity. What do you feel poetry is for you?
I I agree. For me, the same things. I did have a teacher during those years I told you about at the university, um, who made the students write one humorous poem a month. He just
Hmm.
said, "It's good. Do it. It's good for you." I found
Yeah.
that really hard to do.
Hmm.
As I've gotten, this is so many years later, that was, in the '80s that I was getting that degree. As I've come so far in poetry, I'm able to write about everyday things
Hmm.
and humorous things. Don't have to wait for the huge trauma, but it still shows up.
Yeah.
It's still there. And, so that goes back to your question about having to live with it. Um,
Hmm.
so the writer Annie Lamott has a wonderful quote, something like, "It doesn't go away, but you learn to dance with the limp." And
Hmm.
I think that describes it pretty well. Also,
Absolutely.
I think what you said about community, the and my wanting to live in my son's honor, one way to live with grief is to be of help to other people. It
Yes,
connects us to the living rather than
absolutely.
being so sad always. But we have more open hearts, I think, um,
Mhm.
after loss. And so I don't remember your question, Robin, right now, but oh, how do I connect with the grief?
With the poetry. Yeah.
Poetry. And a lot of people think poets are really sad people because there's so much
Mhm.
sad poetry. I'm gonna say, I think they're more fulfilled and sometimes happier people because they
Mhm.
can connect with the
Yeah.
sadness. They don't block it out.
Absolutely. And I liked what you said. I loved what you said when you said dealing or coping with grief, it actually opens your heart. I never thought about that.
Mhm.
And now it's like, can you kind of elaborate on that?
Well, if you share your writing about grief, and there are so many places to share it. One that comes to mind now is a Facebook group called Coffee and Grief. But
Hmm.
there are many places to share grief, to share writing about grief. um, you immediately connect with people. And I really believe, like you do, that that connection opens our hearts. So
Hmm.
when we become vulnerable and share our own experience, in my case through writing, I'm a valuable person to somebody else,
Yes.
right? I'm real.
Uh-huh.
And that's not the everyday thing in our culture. We're
Yeah,
taught to mask a lot of stuff, whether it's in the
absolutely.
workplace or sometimes even with family. And so when you do that, that's the opening of the heart. And also, if you choose to live in the honor of somebody, so you don't have to have lost a person to do that, necessarily. Like, say you lost a job opportunity and it was really disappointing and really hard. Um, who would your model be for getting over that kind of disappointment, for soldiering on and finding
Hmm.
another opportunity? And if you incorporate those attitudes into your open heart, um, nicer things happen than when
Yeah.
we stay in sadness and disappointment. Not that I want to say we should not feel to the fullest extent our sadness
Hmm.
and disappointment, but some people describe poetry as always saying yes, even when it's really sad. There's
Yes.
something yes in it, and it's usually about life because that honestly is the best way to honor someone who had meaning,
Yeah.
is to live well, is to live. I don't mean to live your best life, and have everything you want and go on vacations and, lots of restaurants. I mean your authentic, real self life.
Yeah, I like that. I like that a lot. So tell us more about, because I know earlier before this podcast started, you stated that you have 10 books. So what has that journey been like? How long did it take you to write these 10 books?
Well, let's see. Um, I think the first one came out in the early '90s, although
Hmm.
yeah, and that one I co-wrote with somebody I met, at an event at a school where librarians had invited in writers, to talk about their writing and let the teachers know about them if the teachers wanted to invite them to their classrooms. So
Hmm.
I was at a poetry table. I mean, I brought poetry, and I was at a table next to a woman who was writing young adult novels. And
Hmm.
we had a lot of time to talk to each other, and we didn't want our conversation to end. So we began writing letters to each other about our writing. And then
Uh-huh.
we thought, well, we guess we have a book. Our book could be about letters, or could be our letters.
Yeah.
And we found an agent, and the agent uh, pitched it to Warner's, which is a big publisher,
Hmm.
and the editor she was in touch with took it. And we had to change it a little bit, and we had to write more. They wanted exercises after each chapter and, some other things that would make it more valuable for the people who
Hmm.
were going to buy it. And we had a good time doing that. So that was my first one, and it was very exciting, partly because I had company in that journey, partly
Yeah.
because I found an agent, which was exciting, and it was very unexpected. I I went into the serious part of my writing group hoping to publish one poem. Like, if
Hmm.
I could just publish one poem, if I could have some editor from some literary magazine who never knew me say, "I like this poem, I want others to read it," I would
Yeah.
be that was my goal. But then
Yeah.
what happens is you get into a milieu, you get into a group, you start finding your mates, and then other
Mhm.
things happen. So that was the first one, and then when I was doing that teaching of the people who made me so happy, because although they were afraid of writing, they started writing really well. And one or two of them actually decided to publish their personal essays. Um, I realized I could take what I was doing as a teacher and make it a book. And
Yeah.
that is called, right now, it's in its third edition, has a different title. It's called Writing Personal Essays, Shaping and Sharing Your Life Experience. And what I do is break down different ways to approach the organization, the structure of a personal essay, which we now call short memoir. But
Yeah.
yeah, so there are different ways, and each way helps you say a different thing
Hmm.
or look at the lens of your personal experience through a different look through a different lens at your personal experience. So I had to teach the old. I think I had to, at least I chose to, the old-fashioned way of dividing rhetoric writing into types, categories. You might be familiar. Some people aren't because it wasn't taught that way when they went to school, but description, narration, how to, comparison, contrast,
Hmm.
classification, division, that, all these things. But I managed to make it understandable by pairing a life question with it. So, for
Hmm.
instance, narration, I said, ask yourself, what person, place, thing, or opportunity have you lost? Write about that. And what we all found was you can't write about loss without retrieving something gained, right?
Hmm.
Even if it's just profound memories or a new way of looking at something or moving forward in your life. And I did that for each of those categories of things. And there are 8 of them altogether. So that became a second book, and
Yeah.
which is now in a third edition. Then I started, let's see, publishing my own poetry in a chapbook, which probably isn't available anymore, called Near the Light. And then
Hmm.
I have a book called Behind Us, The Way Grows Wider, which is kind of compendium of previous poetry books with some new poems. And then my newest book is called Since Then, Poems and Short Prose. And the since then is since the death of my son. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, and before that, just 2 more. So I'm not telling. Oh, I wrote books about journaling. I wrote books about, yeah, 3 books about journaling. But I wrote a memoir, prose.
Hmm.
I combined personal essays until I could link them, and I told this story starting with seeing my son um, on life support, surrounded by family, and moving to that wedding date that would have been. And
Hmm.
by to write that way, I had to write memories of him. I had to write things he told me. I had to write how the family coped with grief. And then
Yeah.
when I got to that day, my first reader said, "Well, what about? What about? What about?" Especially about his fiance. So I had to start jumping years, like on
Hmm.
the anniversary of his death for several years more.
Hmm.
And that was interesting to do
Yeah.
that. And then I found a publisher and published it. And then because of that, and because of teaching, I wrote a very small book called Sorrow's Words, Writing Exercises to Heal Grief. And I pretty much share the exercises I gave myself to write.
Hmm.
And it's been a valuable book. Well, everything I did was valuable to me. It helped me write, but I know that it has helped a lot of other people. They're not complicated, they're simple exercises. And if you'd like me to, I could read one of them. Um,
If you'd like to, yeah, go ahead.
I'd like to read this because I think it will help people figure out something. So, um, one of the this they people in grief are often it's often suggested that they write letters to the person who they've lost, and you
Hmm.
can write a letter to an inanimate object. Also, you can write a letter to a place or a time in your
Hmm.
life, and come. So I am looking for the poem. I thought I had it marked. Okay, so I one of the things I did in writing my memoirs, I looked up the meaning of my son's name. His name
Yeah.
was Seth. And you'd think that I knew it was biblical, but I did not know anything else about this name.
Hmm.
And when I looked it up, I found out that there was a mythical character named Seth. And when I
Yeah.
found that out, I wanted to tell him. So, of
Mhm.
course, he was not alive, but I wrote to him. It's not too long. It's called Dear Seth. These days, I find myself calling you Sunboat after a Greek myth I read recently when I looked up the meaning of your name, something I am not sure I ever did, even when your father and I selected that name for you. In the myth, a hero, Seth, has the job of keeping the sun from disappearing. The story goes that the dragon Apophis would from time to time devour the sunboat of Ra as it sailed the skies. When Apophis swallowed the boat, Seth and a friend had to cut a hole in his stomach to keep the world from being plunged into darkness. Losing you plunged me into darkness, but somehow the sun rises and it sets, and it calls to me each day as I watch it rise and watch it set. I know you are the sunboat who cuts the hole through which light and poetry arrive. I am so grateful, Seth, as Ra must have been to his Seth. With love, your mom.
I like that. I like that a lot.
And
And
with,
that's what I feel. One thing, that I said in one of my poems is death is the one thing that it's like it can't touch our memories. And earlier you stated with writing, you kind of open your heart again because you hold on to those memories
yeah,
and
yeah,
learning more, like you said, doing that research, learning more about his name, that kind of was like a feel good moment. It seems like it felt like that. That's kind of the vibe that I got from
yeah.
you when
Thank
you
you.
were
No, it
reading
did. And it's kind of what I mean by, I know this is prose, but it comes to a yes.
it.
Yes. Thank you for being my sunboat. You know,
Yeah.
um, yeah. And it's when you have a profound loss, you can become afraid to
Hmm.
remember. You become afraid that remembering will make you sadder,
Hmm.
or you can only remember really difficult things, like if someone was ill and you were the caregiver or you watched them getting more and more sick, you can't remember before that. And I remember a woman in one of my classes about writing from these kinds of exercises. She said, I feel so much better. Before today, I couldn't remember anything that was joyful about our
Yeah.
lives together. And that was so good. It was such a breakthrough for her. And
Hmm.
and I think writing does that for us. No matter how sad it is what we write, and we don't have to edit out the sadness, but there's something that opens, like we keep saying, opens our hearts to memories that we can bear now. Um,
Yeah.
because we don't want to live without the joyfulness of having had those people in our lives, right?
Absolutely. I agree with that. And then I was writing down, because I didn't want to forget, I wrote down something that you stated. Um, yeah, when you stated that it's about our authenticity when we're writing, it's not about, like you said, going on vacations and, all these wonderful restaurants and everything. I really like hearing that. Can you elaborate more on your feelings on that?
Hmm. Um, well, I know that writing, the way I often say it is, writing creates intimacy. The
Hmm.
first person you become more intimate with yourself by writing. So you
Yes.
write in order to hear your thoughts and your feelings, and it's like a circle, and it comes back to you, and you go, "That's who I am," right?
Yeah.
And then if your work is shared in any way, and publishing merely means to make public, so
Hmm.
whatever way you do that, and you see it register with somebody else, then something else happens inside you. You become more able to be vulnerable, to be intimate with yourself and therefore with others. And I think intimacy and authenticity are, they hold hands. They
Yes.
right. Um, so that's, I guess, my first thing that I would say. Uh, and it's not easy to not criticize yourself. And I
Hmm.
think criticism creates inauthenticity
Yeah.
because it 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 takes power from our own true selves because we're too busy criticizing ourselves or putting
Yes.
ourselves down.
I love
Um,
that.
and it doesn't help us put our real selves forward. And
Yeah.
I think writing helps us be braver about that. And it also helps us know when we can't. For instance, I was teaching a poetry class in person once, and people were brought to tears by a number of the poems that people were writing. And then one woman, between sniffles, said,
Hmm.
"Well, why can't it be like this all day?" I laughed like you did. So I said, well, can you imagine uh, pumping gas, crying at the gas station?
Mhm.
Can you imagine buying shoes, crying? I mean, we can't do that all day. It doesn't mean that we're inauthentic, but uh, we have to moderate our moods, or we would have trouble getting through a day. So I
Yes.
always remember her and how funny that was.
Yes, I had to write that down because I was like, that would actually be a great title is criticism creates inauthenticity. Like I love that because I never thought of it like that, but we do.
Well, go ahead and use it. I hope
Thank
you're writing. Yeah.
you for that. And if there was any advice that you could give listeners coping with grief or coping with job loss or any type of loss, what would you give them? Or what would you say?
Well, I would say to remember that there's healing through the dark emotions. Um,
Mhm.
just there's a woman named Miriam Greenberg, I think, but people can get in touch with me and I'll remember if I'm accurate about her last name. And her book is called, she's a therapist, her book is called Healing Through the Dark Emotions. And
Mhm.
basically, she's saying unless we face our darker emotions, we can't heal. So, one advice I would say is face them, but write about it because that's, whether you're journaling or whether you're just keeping files of your poems that you do or sharing them, articulating it matters. It matters a lot, and it helps us move on. Not that we can move on from loss and be the same person we were before, but
Mhm.
move through. Let me say that move through and become stronger. So uh, I just believe wholeheartedly in the fact that the person wants to write, they can write. It's not. It doesn't have to be as hard as we think it is. And if you could bear with me, there's when I taught this class from the book Sorrow's Words. There was a
Mhm.
man in the class who'd lost his dad, an adult man, in his
Mhm.
60s, had lost his dad, and he was an engineer. He was not a writer, but his wife wanted him to take this class, so he did. And
Mhm.
he wrote three little postcards to his dad. Hi, Dad. I'm going to the Jefferson County transfer station today, the dump. I have to recycle plastic, glass, and paper. It would be more fun if you were with me and we could laugh if the wind were just right and we got a whiff of the garbage nearby. The sun's out and the heat is warm on the back of my neck. I'll do this again in 2 weeks. And his father writes back. Steve wrote back, asked his father, Hi, Steve. I see you're wearing jeans and flip flops. You must be having a nice day in the sunshine. Watch out for the bees. I hope you have your EpiPen handy. Have you gone sailing or flying lately? You sure have a nice house. I love the view. See you in a couple of weeks, Dad.
Mhm.
And just, being able to get that far, that exchange, you can
Yeah,
see not, uh, he didn't have to be a writer to do that. He just had to write it.
absolutely.
Yeah.
I like that. I like that a lot. And as far as for the listeners, like what's the best way to get a hold of you?
Uh, Probably through my website. You can find it with my name. It'll usually say, if you type my name in, Sheila Bender, you'll usually see Sheila Bender's Writing It Real. Or you can go right to writing, like handwriting, writing, ITREAL.com. And there's an about on the navigation bar on top. There's an about and drop down menu. And one of the things is contact me. And a little contact form comes up and you can write your message to me. And I would love it if you told me that you met me on Robin Black's It's All About Healing. That would make me very happy to know you heard us talking. And ask me any questions, and I'll be happy to answer them. And you might see also my listings of some classes I teach and ways to work with me individually if you want to do it that way. So, yeah, that's the best way, writingitreal.com.
All right. And it'll also be listed in the show notes as
Okay.
well. But other than that, did you have anything else that you wanted to add?
That I want to
That
add.
you wanted to add? Uh-huh.
I just want to sign off saying, get to it, right? Don't let anything stop you. And another writer hero of mine, a fiction writer, Ron Carlson, has a mantra. Here it is: write, don't think.
Yeah.
That's what we
Yeah.
have to do. We just have to let our fingers type. We just have to let the pen go and stop thinking. Just do it. Yeah.
Yeah. I like that. Other than that, thank you so much for coming on the show,
You're very
Sheila.
welcome.
And everyone, thank you again. I'm Robin Black, and this is It's All About Healing podcast. Everyone, stay blessed.